and from abroad. I would encourage you to let us know where you are joining from in the Zoom chat. My name is Alyssa Quinn, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. I'm filling in for Byron Holland. He is unfortunately feeling under the weather today and sends his regrets and well wishes. So I am the Policy Program Manager at the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, also known as CIRA, which is the top-level domain registry for the .ca domain. CIRA staff, including myself, fulfill the secretariat and administrative duties for the Canadian Internet Governance Forum on behalf of a multi-stakeholder committee of volunteers from civil society, academia, industry, and government. While we're still in a hybrid pandemic environment, the Canadian IGF All Hands Committee hopes to return these sessions to in-person meetings so that we can have the opportunity to chat in the hallway over coffee and make the in-person contact that we all miss. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items for you. I'd like to let you all know that we are recording today's session as we are broadcasting live to YouTube. De plus, pour les spectateurs qui veulent regarder en français, appuyez sur le monde et choisissez français. The chat window is open for comments. Please remain respectful in your interactions. Also, ensure that you have everyone selected and not just panelists before sending a message. I know that's a mistake that I have made on multiple occasions. We also encourage you to take the discussion outside of the event and to use social media using the hashtag CIGF Talks. Please submit any questions you have for the panelists in the Q&A tab, also located at the bottom of the Zoom window. Questions that are asked in the chat may not be seen by the panelists, so do ensure you're using that Q&A function in Zoom. There is also an opportunity at the end to ask live questions by raising your hand. Before you ask a live question, ensure that your mic is working correctly in order to ask in real time. So today we're going to discuss internet-related sanctions during times of conflict. While we have all watched in horror as Russia wages war on Ukraine, those of us in the internet community have also been examining the effects the conflict has had on the global internet. It's not often that a geopolitical conflict spills into internet governance in such a prominent way, but recent events in Russia and Ukraine have prompted a global conversation about the role of internet governance and the role the community should play in maintaining or restricting access to the internet in times of conflict. First, I will end up asking our panelists what we mean by sanctions. Most of us have historically understood sanctions as penalties that are driven and imposed by nation states against other nations, entities, or individuals. The penalties are designed to stop the target of the penalties from violating international laws or acting aggressively. Sanctions come in a few different forms. There are diplomatic sanctions, which limit or remove diplomatic ties like embassies. There are also military sanctions, which involve military intervention. And then there are economic sanctions, which involve limitations or prohibitions in commerce or trade. I think the category of sanctions we're addressing today is economic in nature, insofar as internet companies servicing international customers are engaged in commerce. But the US government, for example, has indicated that telecommunications services are exempt from Russian sanctions. This has not stopped some companies from proceeding to withdraw their services anyway, opening up a sort of industry-driven sanctions mechanism. In Canada, we've not received such explicit direction. The closest I have seen in my research is the CRTC's revocation of Russia Today's broadcasting authorization, as it is not in the public interest, they have deemed, but that is on the broadcasting side, not on the internet side of policy. There is also a list of specific telecommunications transmission equipment, which Canadians are prohibited from selling to Russia. But the provision of services from companies in Canada to Russia are murkier territory. Finally, I'll add that an open letter has circulated proposing an approach to the multi-stakeholder imposition of sanctions when it comes to the internet. After all, we have historically approached internet governance using the multi-stakeholder model. The letter came after the Ukrainian government requested that the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers remove Russian CCTLDs from the DNS root zone, and also for the RIPE NCC to suspend Russian IP addresses. The letter, which has circulated with several signatories from around the world, recommends a more effective, more precise approach with fewer risks and lower costs. The letter recommends that network operators could make use of block lists for targeted entities like military and propaganda agencies. And it is the best option to ensure no measures on the internet are overly broad and that a block list can be easily undone. Such a block list would be developed by a to-be-determined multi-stakeholder body of experts. This was a unique stance for many of the signatories, as many of them had previously been opposed to all blocking mechanisms on the internet. So a couple of our panelists will dig into that letter in more detail. So this whole scenario begs the question, what does it mean to impose sanctions that hamper internet access? And what are the consequences of severing a nation from the internet? Today, our distinguished panelists, Dmitry Vitaliy, Farzaneh Badi, Tim Denton, and Job Snyders are here to discuss all of it. I'll turn to them to introduce themselves. So I'll just ask our panelists, let us know your name, let us know where you're joining from, and how you define internet sanctions. And I will start with Dmitry, please.
Thank you, everybody. So yes, my name is Dmitry Vitalyev. I'm joining you from Montreal. I'm the founding director of Equality. And my view on sanctions in general, I don't necessarily spend a lot of time defining sanctions for myself. We have frequently met with people in different countries who face sanctions, and we also do work with them. In this particular context, I feel that what is being proposed is more of a delisting mechanism rather than a sanction mechanism. And I have definitely several viewpoints on this. Thank you.
Super. I'll go to Farzaneh next, please.
Thank you, Alyssa. Hello, everybody. My name is Farzaneh Badi. I am the founder of Digital Medusa, and I have worked with as a volunteer with different internet organizations such as Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. I actually focused on sanctions that are imposed by the governments in the US, especially because, and these are like economic sanctions, they are not really addressing the internet in specific. However, they have implications. These sanctions have implications on the internet. And this is a struggle that, it's a long-term struggle that countries such as Iran and Venezuela, Cuba, and those that have been on the sanction list of the US have been dealing with, and it has affected their access to very crucial properties of the internet. And so I will go into that later, but this is what, for me, I think a lot about sanctions, and this is what sanction in the legal term, that when we use it, it means the economic sanctions and policies that governments impose on a certain country to change the behavior of that country. And those sanctions have effect on various sectors, including finances, and they are not specifically to impact access, but they do have impact on access to the internet.
Thank you. Tim, you're up next.
Hi, my name is Tim Denton. I'm speaking from rural Quebec. I have been a commissioner at the CRTC, the Canadian Federal Regulator. I've done a lot of work in various organizations within the ICANN structure for registrars, registries at large at various times. I'm quite familiar with that organization and its multiple forums. I define what we're talking about in terms of the letter from PCH, which we'll get into later, which had a very specific of proposals for an organization to set up to determine what should be blocked or delisted, and then a voluntary mechanism for joining it. And when we get to it, we have to see consider the efficacy of the institutional response, which is it painful and does it work? And what precedents are we creating when we try to make the internet less connected rather than more connected? So we'll leave it at that until we have time to answer the questions directly. But I think we have to consider multiple trade-offs. And if my views seem ambiguous, it's because they are. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Job?
Hi, everyone. I'm joining you from Amsterdam in the Netherlands, a tiny country in Europe. My name is Job Snijders. I'm a software and network engineer at Fastly, but I also contribute my time to various institutions in the internet ecosystem. I'm somewhat in a gymnastic split because on the one hand, I program in the C language on routing security software and interdomain routing suites. But on the other hand, I am a member of the RIPE NCC executive board, PeeringDB. So I'm spread over the whole internet stack, and I co-signed the PCH open letter about internet sanctions. I look forward to having a frank and open discussion with my fellow panelists.
Super. So I have a couple of prepared questions here up front. And this first one is, what do internet sanctions mean in the Canadian context? Is there guidance from the Canadian government on a coordinated or strategic response? Or is it ultimately up to individual companies to make their own decisions as individual actors? And I think I'll pose that one to Dimitri first, please.
Well, as far as guidance, I don't believe there has been any guidance. I believe Canada has taken a strong position on various sanctions against Russia, as well as providing a lot of material and financial support to Ukraine. And I support all of those activities wholeheartedly, and I wish they even ramp up. As it concerns technology and the internet, well, apart from our credit cards not working on the Russian internet and vice versa, I haven't seen any activity or guidance from the Canadian government.
Arzi, maybe you can give us a bit of an international perspective here, if that is the case, that there is no guidance from the Canadian government on internet sanctions specifically.
So basically, when the US started imposing economic sanctions on different countries, it kind of like affected various countries' access to domain names. And now the internet protocol access, and the country and the US and even Europe, when they imposed sanctions, they didn't really have the intention to impact internet infrastructure and access to that. However, and this is why then after a while, the US started issuing general licenses and waivers that would guide the companies to that they can like do certain transactions with the nationals of certain countries. But they also like came up with a list that it's called specially designated nationals. That list has the names of the entities and the people who they cannot do any kind of dealings. So whenever I'm talking about sanctions and imposing sanctions, and when I like disagree, it's because I'm talking about ordinary people. I'm not talking about those in that special designated national list. But the waivers and the licenses, they were not really effective. the problem was that the companies, the moment they see that a country is in the list of sanctions, they don't care if you are in that list or if there is a license. They just block their services to you. And this has been an approach that U.S. companies and some European companies that have dealings with the U.S. and don't want to be affected, they have taken. More and more, when we get into these political conflicts and also like war, more and more the countries come up with these sanctions that will affect access to the internet. I hope I answered your question.
Yes, thank you. And Tim, I think I'll pose the question to you in just a slightly different way. So if it is up to these individual companies to make their own decisions, is it appropriate for them to be deciding to revoke services from Russia? Are there certain services that ought to never be revoked? What are your thoughts there?
Well, my thoughts are such the following. First, it imposes a high standard of thinking about the subject to devolve policy to the level of individual companies. It's much easier when there is a collective decision by somebody in authority to say, you should not be dealing with Russia on these terms or these conditions. So when you leave it up to individual conscience or individual political choices by companies, you're not going to get a coherent response because people's responses will be, relatively speaking, random, some for, some against. So we have not, the letter that Packet Clearinghouse produced and others signed on to was an example of a fairly precise level of intervention. Whether you agree with it or not, at least it had the virtue of being collective, based in internet institutions, and voluntarily agreed to, and if you want to, voluntarily complied with, which I think is the level at which the discussion of sanctions can usefully take place. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay. Job, do you have anything to add, perhaps riffing on the nature of this open letter?
Well, to me, what's important in this letter is technical accuracy and to outline what mechanisms might exist but are not effective, because the cost of weaponizing certain internet infrastructure may have detrimental effects to the global internet. For example, the RPKI was designed to protect what is there, not to be used as a weapon against nations. And if ever the providers of RPKI services would venture down the path of weaponizing internet infrastructure that was designed to be used to protect us, I see clear and present danger, which is what motivated me to participate in offering this letter and informing the wider community on some of the thinking that went into the letter. And I think all panelists will agree that building internet is much harder than destroying internet. And as it stands, as the internet is an abstract human-made structure, I think we have to be very, very careful in cutting the wire, so to speak, because it's very easy. The internet is quite a fragile thing, and I think that, for instance, some examples from the African continent, where nationwide internet shutdowns are used to, for instance, facilitate working against students cheating, is a showcase of how easy it is to break the internet and experience detrimental consequences to entire societies. And to me, that is an example of a disproportionate action. So from that perspective, I'm very hesitant to use the internet access as a means to punish or as a penalty towards groups in society.
Right. I really like that you went into proportionality there. That segues well into my next question, which is, what would the consequences be if Russians were further severed from the global internet? So what's the difference between blocking access to a platform versus deeper layers, blocking at deeper layers or at the infrastructure level? And what does proportionality look like in implementing these either delistings or blocking or full-on revocation of services? Who would like to take that one first? I saw Dimitri on mute.
To stand there. Yeah, you said Russian. I perked up. Let me just give you a little bit of background of where I'm coming from. So, obviously, with a name like mine, I'm from Russia. I was born in Russia. My father's Ukrainian. He was a Soviet political dissident. And I grew up most of my life outside of Russia. Equality develops services, digital security services to protect and promote human rights online, particularly freedom of expression and association. So on one side, we make technology that helps people get around censorship, that helps websites avoid censorship. But then on the other side, particularly since the beginning of the war, we are also running technology services inside Ukraine from which we have decided to censor Russian IPs from. So I believe, as Tim was saying, referring to earlier, that there is power in small companies being able to make their own decisions about what kind of service they would like to run and who they would like to serve. Now, what would disconnecting Russians lead to in Russia, according to your question, both on a platform level and on a more sort of an infrastructure level? Well, first and foremost, I think it would play into the Russian government's current narrative that the West is against us. It would help justify that narrative, and it would help strengthen that narrative. I also think it would actually help rally more people around the government narrative at the moment, and maybe thereby backfire on some of the intentions of these sanctions or delistings being proposed. I think on the other hand, obviously it will limit the, let's say, liberal thinking people in Russia, obviously, from being able to access certain resources which are not hosted in Russia. And they will use a variety of methods to circumvent those stoppages. The strange thing is that whilst they're using these methods now to circumvent the blocks put in front of them by the Russian government itself, by Roskomnadzor, who is blocking up to 1 million different web domains at the moment, they will also be using similar methods to then circumvent blockages being imposed by non-Russian, by Western companies. The flip side of these kind of sanctions, and this is actually an interesting thing to witness from a side, if one can make such a statement at the moment, is that I believe it will lead to the proliferation of decentralized and federated technologies inside the RUNET, the Russian internet. Russia has, considerable internet penetration. Probably around 100 million people are online. A lot of internet companies, a lot of bright minds, who will have to basically react to that kind of reality by becoming, let's say, more self-reliant or nationalistic, if you like, on a network level as well. If they have success in this area, I think that will only bolster the possibilities for disconnecting from the global internet for other countries as well. I'll put a pause in it for now.
Great, thanks. Who wants to pick up there? Tim.
Okay, well, my thought is always turns to the written text of the letter that in its recommendations. Right? Am I off?
Hold on, did Tim freeze for our other panelists? I missed what he said.
Please repeat your last two sentences, Tim.
Okay, if I can remember. The letter from Packet Clearinghouse that was signed on to was very precise in its recommendations. They basically had two levels. First of all, the formation of a new minimal multi-stakeholder mechanism, which would consider which IP addresses and domain names might be blocked or otherwise hampered. And secondly, that organizations would be able to choose to comply or go along with such recommendations. So there's two elements of it. They had carefully considered other technical means as being either too large, disproportionate, ineffective, or whatever, and it was carefully considered. I don't have the technological expertise to understand all the technical considerations, but it was carefully considered. So that at the end of the day, it was proposed that certain names, addresses, and data feeds, names and addresses be blocked or otherwise interfered with. In other words, it was intended to harm precisely the organs of the Russian state or economy that one might like to target if one were so inclined. And that it struck me as, however many problems are associated with that idea, at least it was precise, voluntary, and within the usual domain of how the internet organization goes about solving its problems. And on that basis, I signed that letter, or co-signed that letter, because I thought its solution at least was within the terms of how the internet ought to operate and does. On the other hand, it goes against the idea of unlimited connectivity, which is the core idea of the internet. So if I say my responses are ambiguous, it's because I am feeling conflicted as to what is the best way to go about targeting exactly the people you want to target without excessively violating important principles of why the internet was created in the first place. End of transmission on that point. Thank you.
All right, who's next? Rosie.
Yeah, so basically, I think David Sabine also has asked a question about that we are all in favor of delisting and think that that works. And that is not my position. I think that it is a simplification to argue that delisting and blocking can be proportional and can be effective. You see, when we impose internet sanctions, what are we trying to do exactly? When we say that, oh, they're using it to weaponize, they're weaponizing the internet, how are they exactly doing that? And why are we delisting them? Are we delisting them so that they don't have access to the internet, so that they do not communicate? Because they don't throw bombs on Ukraine through the internet. So that's one thing that I think we should pay attention to. And the other thing is that it doesn't matter if it's imposing sanctions, it doesn't matter if it's multi-stakeholder or through the government or companies. They have been over and over shown that it can be ineffective and it cannot be proportional. Why? Because the people in charge of military, they are in charge of institutions as well, like primary institutions. The moment you want to take and other thing is that we don't know what military strategies are in these countries to be able to like proportionally say that, okay, so I'm only delisting this person. And we have seen that like in other countries that these like people that are in military or sanctioned, they are in charge of, they on purpose, they are in charge of these institutions that run their internet. So then how is that possible to be proportional and effective? And why are we using a mechanism that has over and over not really worked to stop what? To stop the like weaponization of the internet? Is that going to be an effective, or stop military to communicate with each other by the use of the internet? Is that how much that is going to bring us peace and also not affect interoperable internet? And I think these are the things that we should think about. And the last point I wanted to make, just because it's multi-stakeholder solution, it doesn't mean that it's a good solution. A bad solution is a bad solution.
Job, anything to add?
One of the things that has come up in numerous discussions around the world is the role of regional internet registries and whether they should in some way or capacity make changes to their registries, for instance, delisting of Russian resources. My feeling is that some of the conversations are motivated by a desire to do something, and people then look at what tools they have available, and even though they need a screwdriver, they'll try and use a hammer. And I wholeheartedly agree with a number of points that Farsi made, that proportionality, like are we actually hitting what we think is the target? And figuring out what even are military infrastructures on the internet is incredibly hard, because in and of itself, an IP address or an autonomous system number is not synonymous to a specific operation or institution or individual human being. There's many communities aggregated behind either a single IP address or a block of IP addresses or an AS number. And this makes it very challenging to at the RER level to be precise in any imposed sanctions. And then secondly, the moment the registries delist the resources of an attacking nation, that attacking nation to some degree becomes somewhat invisible on the internet. Because if a company, like a cloud provider, wishes to sever communication towards IP addresses registered to Russian organizations, you need a database to produce that list of addresses in order to be able to block them. But if the database turns up empty, because the database itself was used as a sanction, in which I mean that there was a delisting in that registry, the registry devalues to some degree because it contains less precise data or even no data. So it's very hard to figure out what is the appropriate layer to impose sanctions. And I think that given the abstract nature of the internet, my preference is I guess aligned with what was mentioned earlier in regards to telecommunications being exempt from sanctions. That sanctions should focus on aspects of the natural world, tangible assets that you can touch. So, for instance, not shipping weapons towards an attacking country is a great feat, but not providing IP addresses to that country, who knows what the ramifications are? And given that building internet is harder than destroying it, we might not be doing ourselves any favor. Going back to Dimitri's point about circumventing not just the Russian blockades, but also the blockades that are imposed outside Russia, it is. Yeah, I'm somewhat skeptical of some of the proposed mechanisms to lash out to the Russian state using the internet infrastructure itself.
So I'm going to press into the proportionality question a little bit more. So given that we have this proposal on the table from that open letter, which Tim described as precise for identifying, given military autonomous system numbers and IP addresses, and building a block list or a delist list based on those in a similar fashion to what already exists for the creation of threat feeds, which many network operators already employ for cybersecurity purposes. Is it proportional for a network operator, so an internet service provider, let's say, who has end users around their given jurisdiction, so say it was a Canadian internet service provider, would it be appropriate and proportional for an internet service provider in Canada, say, to subscribe to such a multi-stakeholder developed list and block those, delist those domains and IPs from their customers?
If I may respond, I think you posed a question that is a few steps ahead of where the internet community is in understanding this problem space and making up the collective mind on what to do and whether to do anything. Because the question whether Canadian ISP should apply such a list and treat it as a threat list, I think can only be answered if a list exists and it's clear how that list came into existence, what factors contribute to be listed on this, let's call it humanitarian threat list. And I expect ISPs, if such a list were to exist, to first monitor whether the list correlates to internet traffic they observe in their operation and what the potential technical or economic impact could be on their operation if they were to use such a list. So it's I would say there's a few steps that need to happen first before this question can be answered accurately.
Great, that's fair. Anyone else want to jump in?
I have a recollection when we were starting the Deflect service, which is our website security infrastructure. We would rent machines from various providers around the world. And all of a sudden, because we have clientele readership from all around the world, people would start writing, often from Russia, often from China too, saying we cannot access your websites. And when we dug into it, we would find out that that provider was blocking the entire country just by default, just because there was so much spam there or whatever. This kind of over-blocking made by maybe a well-intentioned or insecure service provider, not really caring about that small subset of the internet, because if you allow that part of the internet in, you also have to allow many problems that come with it that would just block the entire country. So whilst you have a few kind of threat actors, making problems from that IP space, you also have millions and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people who are collateral damage to this. So on the one side, this would support, a more detailed and professional way or list for service providers in Canada, for example, to refer to if they would want to take such actions. However, my question is, should this come from a sort of an international multi-stakeholder body, such as we're discussing here? Because if it does originate from this body, then this body also needs to tackle the question of who else should be on that list. Who else is committing, and I'm not going to weigh the scope of violations against each other, but who else is committing human rights atrocities around the world? Should they be on that list? And I'm not sure that, let's say, the ITF, the IGF, more specifically community, is ready to tackle such questions. Although I would be a supporter that it does begin to conduct itself as other international bodies do on these questions.
Farzi, I see you nodding vigorously. Tim as well. I'll go to Tim
No,
first.
I'm not nodding. I'm not nodding at all.
Okay.
Shall I go? All
Yes,
right.
please.
All right. So the question that Farzana posed was, could such a thing be such a forum of discussion, which creates these penalties, be proportional and effective? And she said, I believe, no, it could not be either proportional or effective, one or the other. I don't know, or both. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that idea at all, because I am greatly skeptical of any kind of parliamentary group coming up with a list of IP addresses or DNS addresses to be blocked that would be timely and effective. And we get then to the other problem, which I don't think is more a question of political science and organization than it is of technology, which is, in the letter it speaks of a new minimal multi-stakeholder mechanism. Well, again, multi-stakeholder, that's time consuming and has to be time consuming and is consensus based. Minimal. Well, what does minimal mean? I mean, that's a faint hope clause. I mean, these things grow. They grow in time. They grow in mission. There's mission creep. Dimitri mentioned other regimes that we might like to deal with. And all of these measures, however arrived at, however parliamentary the discussion, however civilized the discussion, have to be measured against, are there not much more effective military measures that could be taken that do not involve the institutions of the internet being, as it were, the word is not too strong, corrupted by these kinds of processes of making the internet less useful? I mean, maybe a well-placed bomb from a drone is the answer that people are actually looking for. What I'm trying to ask, and I think everyone gets my labored way of getting around to it, is by the time this parliamentary institution has figured out which IP addresses to block, the issue will have moved on, and the organization set up to do this will be neither new nor minimal, but we will be old and plagued with mission creep. I think that's institutionally the problem of this kind of sanctions regime imposed through the internet. That's it for now.
Farzi, I'll give you the last word on this one.
Yeah, so I'm surprised that Job says that this is a new initiative and we don't know what the implications are going to be or how it's going to work. I mean, there are so many, maybe not like, there are so many list-based approaches that have been taken, and countries have been dealing with ordinary people residing in sanctioned countries have been dealing with this. With the problem of sanction and not having access to internet services. The problem is that the issue of like this kind of like solution that you're just gonna, that you are gonna prevent companies from over complying with sanctions is just not a coherent solution, because the governments, they're risk averse. And even when the governments tell them that you don't have to over comply with these policies, they still do. And I don't know how they are going to like sign up on this list and not and be like sanction people like proportionately. I just don't think it's going to work. But can we also answer the questions that we're going to go through, because there are a few good questions that I'd really like to answer.
Yes, actually, I think I'm going to take the last two that we have prepared a little out of order. So you just went into the issue of over compliance because companies are risk averse. And so I'm going to give you the question 4. Should Western technology companies operating in countries applying sanctions, such as Lynx or Cogent, who pulled services from Russia early in the conflict, should they have showed more or less restraint before ending their services? And what could this have looked like?
Can I go?
Yeah.
Okay, so basically no. Because that's the law of the, well, a Cogent, in the case of Cogent might, but that's the law that the UK, there were like 2 people that were in the sanction list and were like also in charge of like the telecom organizations that Lynx had their ASs, so they could not. But this is a very good question. Had we, there are other countries that have been dealing with this. What we haven't done is to get those general OFAC licenses, is to get those waivers that, you know, that we go to the government and we ask them to not to impose sanctions on the internet, and also allow for essential internet essential properties of the internet to be accessible and not be hampered by sanctions. So I think that no, they couldn't do that, but we could have at least, because we have been dealing with this for years, we should have been more proactive as a community.
Who's up next on this one? No?
So
Okay.
you say the internet community should have been more proactive, and I view this open letter as a start of a conversation with the community on what can work and what cannot work. The open letter details a number of technical measures that could bubble up in someone's mind when they think of how can we use the internet to hand out penalties. And it lists a number of mechanisms where, at least from the underside people, the conclusion was that it cannot work properly, like removing domain name entries or revoking TLS certificates. So I guess, if anything, we got a little bit wiser on what cannot work, and what the open letter recommends studying is exploring whether a threat list of sorts could maybe work, but it doesn't offer any guarantees that it would work. So your position that this will never work is maybe a valid position, because we have to see, and if nobody in the community stands up to create this parliamentarian institution that would create the humanitarian threat lists of IPs and ASNs, then it will not even materialize, and your point would be proven right. So what is it other than communicating with each other through open letters that the community can do to show its proactiveness?
I saw one of these. Would you like to respond?
So I think the community, we had like advised ICANN to come up to apply for a general license for waiver of sanctions and for the new GTL. That has not, we advised them long time ago, that has not happened. So, and they're like, and you know that Iran and Syria, they have problems with access to their IP addresses. That is not a new issue. We knew about this for a long time, and we still didn't do anything about it. I mean, I'm not saying that they are not doing anything about it. I'm just saying that, you know, as a community, RIPE NCC has been very, very good and diligent on this. But as a community, we should have paid much more attention, especially now that Afghanistan has also like joined the list. So the list is going bigger and bigger. So by a statement of an imposition of sanction, I don't think we can solve those problems. It's the compliance with sanction. Maybe you can do something about it, but imposition of sanctions, I don't think that we can actually use that as a solution. And Alyssa, can we answer this human rights question? I don't want to talk all the time, but I kind of like really want to answer that question.
Sorry, is that one in the Q&A?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just gonna ask our final prepared question, and then we're gonna go to the Q&A for the last half hour. So,
oh yes, true. We have so much time. Sorry.
yes, we have plenty of time left. Yeah, no, we're not done at past. We have the rest of the hour. So first, Tim or Dimitri, did you have anything to add on this line of discussion?
Not for me, no. I'll wait for the next question.
Super. And so my final question to you guys before we go to that Q&A is, and Job touched on this a little bit, what role have multi-stakeholder internet governance institutions like ICANNs and the RIRs played so far in the conflict? And what could they be doing that they haven't? And so first, I'm just noticing that we have a lot of attendees who are sort of newer to the community and might not have a full understanding of these internet governance institutions. So first, when we say RIR, we mean Regional Internet Registry, and there's one which roughly corresponds to each continent that is responsible for the distribution of internet number resources, that's IP addresses and autonomous system numbers. And so the RIPE NCC has received a request to do something about IP addresses that have gone to Russia. And ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, is the sort of global coordinating body for policy around top-level domains. And both of these operate in a multi-stakeholder fashion. So sort of back to the question here, what role do these internet governance bodies have, and have they played so far?
Well, I'll answer. According to written statements, they've studiously declined to limit internet connectivity on this political basis that is being proposed. They have said that the internet is for open communication, and our institutions will not be engaging in behavior or actions that would make it less useful, less open, less end-to-end, leaving that for other players or actors. But so both ICANN and RIPE, who were asked by the Ukrainian government to do something, have declined to do anything. And the PCH letter was an attempt to get a new institution, a new subset of an institution going that could discuss this. And so far, that has been the only proposal that might eventually, possibly lead to some kind of sanction. And I'm still not clear whether anyone believes that would be proportionate or effective. So we're in a, the talking shops of the world on domain name governments and number governance have declined to talk about it. So that's where we're at. And other sanctions, like money and fuel, seem to be the ones that are in the real world and will be employed. And internet-related activity will be marginal at best to any of the outcomes of any of these struggles.
Okay. Anyone else on this one?
You want to get?
I can add just briefly that what I have seen, and this isn't about sanctioning Russia or Russian institutions, it is about helping Ukrainian institutions and Ukrainian ISPs. I have seen small teams within RIPE and within other international internet bodies set up urgent response mechanisms whereby they fundraise and purchase equipment, look out for what cables or other internet infrastructure is damaged by military activities, and then organize, shipping routes into the country to make sure that the internet in Ukraine holds. And I think they and others like them, are very much also responsible for the fact that the Ukrainian internet has held up so well. I think one of the kind of best responses to an aggressor is to be strong, to be resilient, and particularly as we're talking about the internet, to make sure that your internet is functioning as well, irrespective of any military or cyber aggressions which are being launched by Russia.
Farzi?
Sorry, I was just like, I totally agree with Dimitri, and I believe that there are the militarization of the internet is a real issue that we need to prevent, and I would love to see that day. But I don't think it can be done by imposing sanctions, especially at the internet infrastructure level. Now we are talking about, and here I talk about like access to internet infrastructure, not anything else. And what we should be doing is to strengthen Ukraine and Afghanistan and other countries in war and civil conflicts. We should strengthen their access to internet, and that would, in effect, and not think about like how do we weaken access to internet infrastructure in the aggressor country, because as I said, we can't do this proportionally.
Job, you have the last word on this one if you want to take it.
I absolutely understand the Ukrainian government calling upon every possible ally and asking every possible institution that could maybe move the needle in some direction towards peace, that they put these requests forward. And it's deeply regrettable that institutions like ICANN or specifically RIPE NCC are not positioned to comply with their requests. I don't consider the request unreasonable, and I do not consider RIPE NCC's position unreasonable for the reasons outlined in the response to the Ukrainian government. Ultimately, my personal preference is aligned with what Tim Denton suggested, that fuel and money are perhaps the most effective measure rather than these abstract things, IP addresses or AS numbers. End of transmission.
Dimitri, I see your hand.
Yeah, sorry, just to throw in one more log into the fire. Another way of punishing, let's say, Russia or Russian institutions as sanctioning or delisting supporters would be to make their censorship mechanisms less effective. There are certain steps that international stakeholders, internet relevant stakeholders can take in regards to traffic confiscation, in regards to decoy routing, in regards to other standards and protocols that would make the ever-growing and omnipresent Russian firewall less effective, if not completely ineffective. If our role is to approach this problem on several different levels. And I think apart from sanctions, we should also be talking about disabling internet oppressors, disabling the technology and the means by which countries block the internet. And why did they block the internet? Because they want to maintain a certain, dogma, a certain propagation within their societies, propaganda within their societies. A multi-stakeholder approach can also be a multi kind of platform, multi-protocol, multi-technology approach. And I think the outcomes of such a technology may finally begin to drive the internet to the place that was promised to us about 30 years ago. But maybe that deserves a different panel.
Yes, maybe in the future. Okay, everyone, we are right on time. We're going to turn to the audience questions now. So, Farzi, you've already picked one out that we can start with, and that is, do you think that internet access should be a human right?
So this question was like a hot topic at Internet Governance Forum a few years ago. And, various people had opinions about this, and some activists thought that it should be a human right, and some thought that it should be kind of like a service, essential access to essential services like water. And more and more, as we see, when we talk about the internet, we should also clarify what we are talking about, because so for me, I don't mean like internet services and those that function on the internet, like social media and Twitter and stuff like that. When I'm talking about, in this case, I mean the access to internet infrastructure. So, and if you block access to internet infrastructure, then people cannot really connect to the global internet. This is not the case in other services. So I think that's, while I don't think if it's a human right or not, or if it's a helpful framework, I think that access to internet infrastructure has become an essential day-to-day living that we need to have access to. It's kind of like, it's becoming like the switch. It's becoming like the pipes. And I know it's a bad analogy, but so when we think about like sanctions, and when we think about like infrastructure, like blocking infrastructure, we should think about what sort of impact this is going to have for people to have access to essential services. And and the other question, and I think this relates to the other question that somebody mentioned, that should we have these cyber deterrence initiatives and like Solarium in the US. And I think, yes, exactly. That is how we can keep access to the internet unhampered, but at the same time, fight with weaponization or I don't know, these cybersecurity attacks and all sort of attacks that that are sponsored by nation states on the internet. So that way we might be able to not have an impact on access to these pipelines and these essential services, but also stop the attacks and militarization on the internet.
Anyone else want to tackle should internet access be a human right? Or do you think it is?
If I can offer a lightweight joke, I think one of the articles in the list of human rights is freedom of torture, and access to everybody's social media accounts would be in conflict with that. But on a more serious note, I'm not convinced internet access would need to be a human right. I think human rights should very much focus on the essentials to foster human life. And I'm confident I could have a very happy life without internet access, but less so without access to justice or being the victim of discrimination or not having food and water. So I wish everybody to have access to the internet, who wants access to the internet, so they can use it productively in some capacity. But considering it a human right is maybe a step too far at this point in time.
Yeah, I'd like to weigh in as well. Having spent the last 20 years working on technology to protect and promote human rights, for many of those years, I was very much a supporter of this statement. However, maybe as I've gotten grayer and more cynical, I'm starting to doubt myself. I believe that access to the internet is a privilege. It is a privilege simply by the fact that half the people on this planet cannot have access to the internet. It is also really a responsibility. The sort of mass exodus of people to the internet, mass influx of people to the internet has not really given us a network that erased all of the existing barriers. It simply recreated them in the digital space, pushing more and more people online so that they immediately become, advertising profiles and products. Also doesn't equate to a human rights framework for me. And then at the same time, allowing technology companies, whether software or hardware companies, freely sell their products to companies and nation states and other institutions that then use them for surveillance, for oppression, for many nefarious things. Should they have the same level of access to the network as everybody else? Should it be a human right for them as well? So I think the network that we have ended up with does not support this statement for me. And whilst we have had the privilege to have been on the internet for those 30 years to make up our own opinions about it, I don't necessarily think that new people should be forced to have this privilege as well.
Okay.
Well, give me a moment. Okay.
Yes, sir.
The question is fatally confused. There is, of course, the problem of poverty and technology and overcoming it so that people have access to the internet, like as a physical device with computers, whatever. Of all claims that someone else should spend money so that I have a right. Or put it another way, I have trouble understanding what people mean by a right in any legal, meaningful, moral sense, when really what the right consists of is an access.
Well, it seems
Internet connection.
Tim, your internet connection in rural Quebec and your right or non-right there too is being frustrated. If you could repeat your last two sentences.
I have difficulty with the idea of a right, which is a kind of idea, a moral idea, when what we're really talking about is access to a technical apparatus. That's the first point. The second point is that here in Canada, we have legislation before the Parliament that would take Canadians' right to communicate across the internet and subject it to government permission, which is what the Bill C-11 on broadcasting really says. Now, what kind of right is it when when I am communicating through the internet by sound or video, when that ability is subject to government permission. So when I say the question is confused, it's like I can have the technical apparatus to communicate, I can have better connectivity, but if the government is telling me everything I communicate across the internet is subject to prior government permission by way of licensing, that's not a right any longer. And right now, the relevant question in Canada is not a technical ability to communicate across the internet or wealth or connectivity, important as these questions are. The real issue is government going to succeed in subjecting massive amounts of Canadians and their communications to government licensing conditions? So clearly the Canadian government has decided that internet access might be a right, but communicating across it is a privilege to be accorded by the state, which is utterly contradictory, but never mind. That's the world we're living in.
And perhaps fodder for another future Canadian IGF. I know that's one of the topics that crops up time and time again in our committee meetings. Okay, the next question I'm seeing from the attendees is with respect to the US Cyber Solarium Commission. Are any of our panelists familiar with that? No, I'm not personally familiar with it either. So apologies to anonymous attendee. That's something that we can all look into, but I don't think we can address it today.
Alex, I'm a little bit familiar. So they are, they get together and do some kind of like attribution and kind of like looking at evidence of cyber attacks. And also like, it's not only cyber solarium, it's also like, you know, Canada has been like, they call them like Five Eyes. So they have been like working with other country, like-minded countries like the US and New Zealand, Australia. I don't know, that's not five, but anyway, in order to deter state cyber attacks, and also like hold states accountable if they undertake cyber attacks. And I think that is definitely one way of going towards like demilitarization of the internet, and also like not allow states to attack each other.
Okay, so solarium.gov, something for us to look into. Next one I'm seeing is on the comment, they don't throw bombs on the internet. Do these sanctions affect the ability for Russia to hack into Ukrainian systems and install malware or wiperware? Or are these sanctions solely based on commerce and information? So I'm not sure exactly to which sanctions this question is referring, but as a general question, would anyone like to answer that? Job?
I do not believe that any form of internet sanctions would ever hamper a nation state's ability to use the cyberspace as a weapon against other entities present on the internet. This is the problem with illegal hacking, that people hire experts to circumvent protection mechanisms, and I do not believe we would be capable to stop that through sanctions. I mean, if you look at the hacker movie, all you need is a coin and a bit of wire to get into systems, and yeah, it's
a hoodie,
it's a really nice spot, but yeah.
Okay. I want to remind the attendees that you can raise your hand to ask a live question as well. So if you would like to take advantage of that opportunity, please raise your hand and our admin on the back end, Georgia, will facilitate that. Oh, I'm seeing a hand from Hisham Al-Kadumi. I'm going to allow you to talk, Hisham. So you are unmuted,
Yeah.
Hisham.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for this. It's been like, it's really useful. Well, my question is, I also submitted in the Q&A because I worked in surveillance, and the thing is, the more sanctions we put, and I'm not trying to defend anybody, but this specifically digital sanctions, that comes with a package of governmental overreach and more governmental surveillance, and we're opening the Pandora box for that. So my fear is if we allow those kinds of sanctions, then it might be taken advantage to surveil the citizens of those countries, like in Canada or in the US or something. How can we balance that to support the Ukrainians and at the same time do not harm the Russian people and do not keep that, like checks and balances on the government so they do not use that to broaden up their surveillance and, the more surveillance and privacy breaching for their citizens. Thank you very much.
Who wants to take that one? How do we prevent overreach?
I guess one way to prevent overreach would be not to engage. The statement on broadening government's surveillance powers, and not only governments, but companies' surveillance powers as well. I'm not sure if we can broaden them anymore to what they already are. The internet being an open framework by design, kind of built for surveillance, or surveillance to you, network monitoring to me. What is it that we can do to help Ukrainians outside of those sanctions? Well, I think a lot of effort has already been done on the levels we have discussed. The problem is that, well, in my opinion, as opposed to the regulated financial markets where sanctions can be both specifically targeted and immediately noticeable, the internet is not the same type of regulated network. And I believe, as John Gilmore said in the past, that the internet routes around censorship. And I think the internet routes around most problems put in the way of it. I believe that if we're to consider one of the causes of this war to be the effectiveness of Russian propaganda, both inside Russia and remarkably in the West as well, as we all witnessed the various sort of debacles that had happened in the run-ups to the US election, so on and so forth, all around the world. That what we can really do is to begin lessening the role and impact of internet surveillance and internet censorship, and making sure that no government has the ability to control the internet the way that it wants for its own citizens. It's a little bit ambiguous, but I'll stop there for not having a more specific answer.
Anyone else on this one?
Another question, please.
Okay. So next one I'm seeing is, and actually this feeds well from the last question, misinformation and disinformation are newspeak words that our governments use for censorship. To encourage international understanding, internet communications should be kept as open as possible, even especially with citizens of countries we may be at variance with. And the Russia-Ukraine conflict is by no means as clear as Western propaganda makes out. So this person's question is, what do the panelists think of that comment?
I wholeheartedly agree. Do you want more? I can go on for more, but I
would
agree.
love more. We have 9 minutes. I would love more.
Okay, well, yeah, misinformation and disinformation depend on your point of view. Vaccines are safe and effective. No, they're not. The world is warming up by 1.5 degrees centigrade in a century. No, it isn't. I mean, what is the information? What is the disinformation? A lot of people seem to think that we can escape from political contention if we can just press the thumb down hard enough on one side of the scale and prevent others from speaking. There's a great fear of public debate and public contention these days. And we seem to be in one of those moral panics where it's felt that disinformation is causing things to happen, when in fact, I don't see anything unusual in the fact that people don't agree, and people cannot be made to agree, and people should not be made to agree. And we have institutions for dealing with these kinds of disagreements. They're called political parties and elections. And governments seem to be in the stage of, as they say, of a moral panic about political disagreement, thinking that everything is founded on disinformation and misinformation, which is their interpretation of how dare these people have an opinion which differs from the received consensus. So yeah, that's why I agree. There we go. Done.
Well, here at Canadian IGF, we prefer that you disagree because it makes for a better conversation. So we'll leave you with that. Does anyone have anything to add on this line of discussion?
Actually, in the statement that I think you signed, Tim, there are two targets. One is military agencies. It's delisting military agencies, and the other is propaganda. So how does that go with your opinion on like information is information, and how can we like come up with a mechanism that actually can identify what is propaganda? I totally agree that it is a very political thing. What is misinformation in for one political party's information for the other. And we have seen that in social media platforms also have made mistakes when they were doing like their fact checking, and we don't have the right tools and mechanisms to make a decision and set an accurate decision of what is an objective decision as well, like what is misinformation, and which we have ended up doing it based on nationality or political party. I mean, no, it's not gonna happen. This is why I'm also like very skeptical about this statement.
Yeah, I can somewhat disagree as well. I think that internet communications should be kept as open as possible. However, I don't think that will encourage international understanding. I think actually the opposite, which is why, back to my previous comment, I don't think necessarily that access to the internet, let's say to the platforms of the internet, should be a human right, because we've all seen actually what the powers of global communications, one to many, many to many, in both the good and the bad sense of it. I think the labels of misinformation and disinformation have been attempted in order to address what some would classify as the bad aspects of this global intercommunication platform. But then, of course, to Tim's point, who's going to define what is bad and what isn't? So yes, internet communications should be kept as open as possible. And yes, we will then need to deal with the fallouts of that, not from a legislative point of view, I think, but from a capacity building point of view.
Okay, so I think with that, we'll wrap it up. Any last words from folks before I free us all?
Well, I can particularly agree with Dimitri that increases of the capacity of international communications does not necessarily lead to peace, friendship, and amity between countries. And the telegram was thought to revolutionize communication, and it had no symbol. It hasn't. Humans are humans, and a conflict is built into different ideas of religion, morality, the state, and everything else, and cannot be eliminated by technical means. So, yeah, increases of international communication and freedom to communicate will not necessarily lead to peace, love, and happiness for all around. But I still think free communication is vital for the maintenance of an open society and for the maintenance of free discussion in science. So you can't escape conflict.
Job, anything to wrap up?
I think in closing, I want to emphasize that if we want a global internet that is securely accessible by everyone, it means we create technologies that make it as safe as possible for everyone. And that includes both victims and attackers. It is like cryptography. There cannot be any backdoors in it, because with a backdoor, the technology is useless. So in the best interest of a country like Ukraine would be to provide them with equipment to replace broken infrastructure or to repair broken infrastructure, but also to continue, or at least I personally will continue my efforts in securing BGP routing through the RPKI, because I think ultimately the internet can only be strong if cryptography is used, and this means that if we have a strong internet, it helps Ukraine, but that also means that Russia, to some degree, can stay connected to the internet because of this attempt to make a level playing field of the internet itself. So, thank you all.
Thank you, Job. Barzaneh.
So in 2018, I think I came to Canada IGF, and that was my first time in Canada. And I was coming from the US, and there was all this social media and the internet. They have elected Trump for us, and they have done all these things, and they just kept blaming social media and the internet. While the Canadians at the time had a wonderful objective approach to internet governance, and it was a breath of fresh air when I attended that session. And things have changed a little bit the past 4 years, and I just want to remind the Canadians that that objective approach was very refreshing, and also something that we really need among the internet community, and to keep the internet global and interoperable and help Ukraine, as well as keep the rest of the world connected as well. And I hope that you continue championing for global interoperable internet.
All right, Dimitri, you're going to close us off.
Yeah, thank you. We will also continue to do our utmost to help the Ukrainian internet, to help Russians who are mobilizing against their regime and who are trying to break through the firewall and inform others in the country about the realities outside of Russia. And I also wanted to make a small plug. Equality, my organization, has lobbied the IGF Secretariat to bring the 2024 IGF Summit to Montreal. I think that is at the last levels of decision-making over there, but we could definitely use your support for this. There is a link on our website with other organizations for supporting this move. And the 25 Summit is being planned in Russia. So I think there could be very interesting and important discussions to be had at the IGF summit beforehand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you to our speakers for a spirited discussion and to the Canadian IGF All Hands Committee for organizing. And most of all, I want to thank our attendees. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will continue to do so in the future. Please stay tuned for more from Canadian IGF. We're aiming to bring you another session in the speaker series next month. That will be on competition policy. And we look forward to seeing you at an in-person event as soon as it is practical to do so. And with that,